Good morning and Boker Tov to everyone, with the exception of our guest Haviv and anyone else who happens to be in Israel, where we say Erev Tov. And our conversation today is with one of Israel's best-known columnists and writers. But let me just share a few introductory comments. And that is, I can safely assume that all of us are American rabbis, American Jews who care deeply about what's happening in Israel, are following and are captivated by the ongoing crisis, originally prompted by the proposals first put forth by the governing coalition for judicial reform several months ago, and then the response to it. There have been calls primarily from those who are opposed to the legislation and who have been demonstrating on Saturday nights to American Jewish groups to weigh in. The Zionist Rabbinic Coalition just returned from a highly successful mission celebrating the Abraham Accords. And we were the guest of the United Arab Emirates, of Bahrain, and of Israel. And one of the things that we heard, I wanted to share with you from the minister in the UAE was interesting advice. It made an impression on many of us, and it's one of the questions that we'll ask Haviv to comment on. And that is, he basically was saying, while all of this is happening, he encouraged us to not be airing our dirty linen in public, in the sense that if there are controversies, we should work on them amongst ourselves. So in that light, we thought it was important to present the conversation about what's going on and different thoughts about that. In Israel, I just want to let you know that part of our mission, we had extraordinary access with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who basically told us what he said in subsequent interviews with the Wall Street Journal and the and Bloomberg just as recently as yesterday, about what legislation will be considered, what won't be considered. We had an hour with Ron Dermer, meetings with the Minister of Heritage, Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Foreign Affairs, Speaker of the Knesset. We did meet with members of the opposition in the Knesset, as well as Rav Stav, Nathan Sharansky, Tal Becker, and others, Bahrain's ambassador to Israel. That was in 2 days. And I'm not mentioning all of it. So let me just also finally say that our conference is coming up this coming Monday night. It begins, it goes through Wednesday, concluding with lunch at the Embassy of Israel and the ambassador who will be speaking with us. If you haven't yet signed up and you'd like to join us, please do feel free to do so. Just go to our website, zionistrabbis.org. With that, and let me now get straight to the program we have. Haviv Gur will be speaking. We'll be taking the few people have sent me questions already, which I'll present. Others who have questions are welcome to put them in the chat, and I'll present them to Haviv. And then after that, assuming we have time, we're going to have a chance for an open conversation among rabbis. Just what are we feeling? What are we thinking? The part of what Zionist Rabbinic Coalition tries to do is to provide the forum and the outlet and the opportunity for rabbis to meet and discuss together in a respectful way, whether we agree or disagree with each other. But that's part of what we want to try and do, is to find out how we build bridges of unity. So Haviv Gur is familiar to many of us, a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's covered Israeli politics, foreign policy, education system, and relationship with the Jewish diaspora since 2005. He's taught at and has been rather the director of communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Haviv right now to present us a bit of an overview of the current dynamics of what's happening. And then after that, we'll open it up a bit. So Haviv, thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to start at the end because this is not a crowd that needs an introduction to the judicial reform. It's not a crowd that needs to be told that for 32 weeks we've had hundreds of thousands of people protesting consistently, unflaggingly. This is not something Israelis are familiar with, never mind any other, democracy at this scale. We have polls that suggest that something like 1 in 3, at the very least 1 in 4 Israelis has actually been out at a protest. And so this is an extraordinary moment. There is a sense that this is a pivot for this country. There is a sense that the country that comes out of this event is not going to be quite the same country that went into it. And most people, when they agree to that statement, mean it very pessimistically. There is a sense that this country is going into a bad time. We are having every fight you can imagine about every illiberal suggestion by every illiberal member of this coalition. I'm talking about illiberal in the sense that Likud has been repeatedly embarrassed by the proposals and the legislation and the scandals and all the different things that this coalition has produced alongside the judicial actual reform proposals, which have framed the reform proposals as an illiberal attack on democracy, etc., as the opposition sees it. The opposition isn't crazy to view those kinds of bills, those kinds of events, as signaling the intent of the reformers. There is a good argument on the right that the court is very powerful. There is a good argument on the left or center left that it went way too far, and therefore there's good reason to question the intention of the people pushing the reforms. I'm going to leave all of that aside. And I mean, I just said it, so we're done. But what I want to say to you is that I am increasingly and deeply optimistic. I am getting more optimistic by the day. I'm getting more optimistic with every new development. I'm getting more optimistic with every new scandal, every new illiberal proposal, every new crisis. I'm getting more optimistic the more Netanyahu's weakness is clarified. Netanyahu is a man, there's a debate in Israel about Netanyahu. Is he powerful, in control of this coalition, as he keeps insisting to absolutely anyone who will listen overseas? Every American newspaper, every American television channel, every American podcaster seems to be able to get an interview with Benjamin Netanyahu today, and no Israeli outlet that doesn't fawn over him has been granted that interview. He won't interview with Channel 12 or Channel 13 or Haaretz or Yediot or any other news, or us, of course, also. He won't interview with people who will ask him hard questions. But the main message he takes to the world in his blitz of media appearances to the world is, I have both hands on the wheel. Everything's going to be fine. You can ignore the rhetoric coming out of Itamar Ben-Gvir. Is that right? Is that correct? Or is he, in fact, got a 64-seat coalition, and that means that if he loses 5 seats, his coalition begins to fall apart, and Itamar Ben-Gvir alone has 5 seats. In other words, every single coalition member has him over a barrel. Increasingly, it looks like it's the latter. I have thought it was the latter, and I've written that it was the latter, for the duration of the last 8 months. That was considered a pro-Netanyahu argument for about 8 months, because if he is not in control, then it's not his fault. It is his fault for bringing some of these radical elements into the Knesset with him so that he could win an election. It's his fault for being, a self-serving politician. I've never met a politician who doesn't think that if they don't win, the country is going to be hurt by it. So it's his fault for being that, but it's not his fault for pushing this reform, for causing the kind of break, the kind of real fracture that people are feeling on left and right and everywhere in Israeli politics. They're feeling a sense of crisis, and he didn't cause the crisis. There's essentially a vacuum of power that some of the more far right forces in Israeli politics are taking advantage of. The big question is which is actually happening, and then increasingly it is becoming clear to everyone, to critics on the left who said this was a nefarious conspiracy from the start. It is increasingly becoming clear just how weak Netanyahu really is, and how much of this is a coalition kind of stumbling along, and how much of it is folly rather than malice. By the way, none of that is an argument against judicial reform, just to clarify. It's an argument for how it was done, for the illiberalism of all the different legislation and proposals and ideas around it, for how extreme it was, which even its own proponents have admitted many times already. Long story short, we're in a moment of crisis, and we're in a moment of crisis that makes me very, very optimistic about our future. And I'll explain why very, very briefly, and then I'll stop talking. We're in a moment of crisis in which every single thing that we are fighting about, every single thing that Israelis are frustrated and angry and a little bit terrified about, is very, very old. Everything. The ultra-Orthodox separation from the rest of Israeli society, which includes a massive welfare state specially built for them, which includes massive incentives by the state at other people's expense not to work enough for huge parts of that community. It's not just that the lack of military service, it's the lack of any kind of public service, the lack of a sense of solidarity with the rest of Israeli Jews. That whole thing was, I don't know if it was tolerable, it was ignorable when they were 3% of the population at the founding of Israel. They're now 13% of the population. It's becoming harder to ignore. And that is a big part of this conversation. Folks, we don't just have a very powerful court, probably the most powerful court in the free world. It is reasonable for the Israeli political right to argue that this court needs to be weakened. But on the other side of the aisle in the legislature and the executive, we have almost nothing at all. We have almost no institutions of any kind. There's no checks and balances. We have a unicameral parliament. We have a parliamentary system in which, like Britain, like Canada, the parliament elects the government. But unlike Britain and unlike Canada, we don't even have direct election of the MPs, of the members of Knesset. Who actually appoints a member of Knesset onto the list? The Israeli voter only votes for a list. The person who appoints the member of Knesset onto a list is the leader of the party. And the leaders of the parties of the majority of the parliament become the cabinet, become the executive branch. And so in Israel, functionally, the executive branch literally appoints the parliamentary majority. This is the most unified, unitary legislative executive in the democratic world. And alongside that unitary legislative executive, the only real check we've ever had was either the coalition not getting along within itself, and therefore, no majority could form that could oppress minorities, et cetera, or the court. Now, that's a massive lacuna at the heart of our system. We have a democracy built almost by accident, with no institutions, no checks and balances. We don't have a Bill of Rights. Many countries don't have a Bill of Rights. Australia does not have a Bill of Rights. And so far, we haven't felt that problem. We haven't felt the lack of a right to free speech, a right to a free press, a right to assembly and petition, a right to freedom of religion. We didn't need the right because we had it in practice. We had it as a social reality. We had it because all Israelis understood you're not shutting up other Israelis, even if you try. But we never wrote it down. We have reached a point where on a dozen issues like that, and all of them are mixed in to this cauldron of judicial reform, opposition, protest, the whole business. All of these different imbalances, all of these lacunae, all of these holes at the heart of our system, at the heart of our public life, are now on the table. Israelis are now talking about the Israeli Supreme Court with deep awareness, and they were never doing that before. Israelis are now telling us that they understand that the court is immensely powerful. They also understand that there's nothing else. And so what we actually need is not to defeat the Israeli right and show them who's boss. And what we also need is not to defeat the Israeli left or center left or the secular half of the country and show them who's boss by destroying that court and leaving absolutely no check on majority power, on executive power in this country. What we need is a new constitutional moment where we have new balances, new checks. The problem with this government was, I would say 5 months ago, many Israelis saying, oh my gosh, they want to dismantle democracy. Look at this extreme version of this reform. The problem today is perceived a little differently. I'll just say 2 sentences on the numbers that we have, and I'll stop talking. Israelis, when the government was established in late December, something like 65-70% of Israelis, depends on the polls, depends how you ask the question, said they supported judicial reform of some kind. More than 2/3 supported judicial reform. Today, 25% of Israelis support this government passing judicial reform. That's a collapse, not in the principle of having judicial reform. We have this immensely powerful court with a vetting system for appointments to itself. This is something that's worth looking at. But it's a collapse of trust in this government's judgment. And so we have 25% who say the reform must pass as is. And we have about 30-35%, depending on the poll, saying no reform of any kind, even if it's something I once supported. That government can't be trusted to do it because of the radicals in it and their power, et cetera. And then we have about 40% in the middle. And the 40% in the middle are fascinating. The Israel Democracy Institute Peace Index, what do they call it? The Israel Index. They have this monthly poll they've been having since the early 90s. It's a wonderful poll, but they've changed its name a couple of times. The Israel Democracy Institute Index last month found that those 40%, basically what they want is a judicial reform that left and right can agree to together. On this theory, apparent theory, which is a very rational theory for most people, that if left and right agree to the judicial reform, it won't cause harm. So nobody has a majority, and you have this immense middle that wants people to reach across the aisle. And the final thing that that middle didn't used to exist. That middle about judicial reform, that middle that understood that both sides are right and we have to build a new constitution. Both sides are wrong in the sense that we need more institutions. It's okay to weaken the court if you give us other checks and balances. And if you don't give us other checks and balances, weakening the court it sure looks like something malicious. And the last thing that makes me optimistic is what everyone is gnashing their teeth over and terrified about, which is all the reservists saying they're not going to volunteer. Here's how I read the reservists saying they're not going to volunteer. These are people, I spent about 20 years in the Israeli reserves. I served in the infantry, and going for a month to the army every year was probably one of the more significant things I did in my life. I generally get paid to talk. I generally just talk even when I'm not paid. So I just talk a lot. So I'm one of those people who talk. This was something I didn't do talking. This was something I did. And this was really foundational to my life and to my identity. Very little could have gotten me to quit my reserve duty. They had to kick me out because I got old. Folks, the people who are saying they're going to quit the reserve duty, these 10,000 soldiers, it may be half that, we're not sure exactly about the numbers. Those people are commandos. Those people are pilots. Those people have done a day a week for 15 years. This is, outside of their families, the single most important thing that they do. When they say, I'm not going to serve anymore, are they actually not going to serve? 140,000 rockets are thrown at us from Lebanon. They're not going to fly. They're going to look their kids in the eye and say, I'm sorry, I can't fly, judicial reform. What they're saying is the Israeli way of talking about fundamental things. They're saying, I have a 6-year-old son. I have 4 kids. My 6-year-old now has a habit of every time he's sad and every time I'm not paying him attention, he says to me, I hate you. When my 6-year-old yells at me, I hate you, does he mean that he hates me? What does he mean? He means I feel something. I need you to notice that. You're not noticing that. I'm experiencing that as treason, as a kind of betrayal. I love you and I need you, is what I hate you means. And I kind of think that's kind of what's happening here. That's true of adults as well. Sometimes our anger is love. Those Israeli pilots are saying, dear right-wingers who are pushing this reform, you think you're doing something, it's this intellectual elite on the right that is advancing and pushing and dedicated to this. You think you've got it all figured out, but you don't have it all figured out. And mocking us as people who don't understand that the court is too powerful isn't enough. You are breaking something fundamental. Please notice that. Please look at that. This is a conversation Israelis have not had. This is a conversation that is penetrating the manipulative political campaigns that have taken over the politics of the democratic world. This is a conversation that is cutting through a whole lot of garbage and a whole lot of fog of war. And Israelis are talking. The ultra-Orthodox are having a conversation in their own press about their own responsibility for the first time. People are starting to be embarrassed on all sides. People are starting to notice. The left has had to explain why there are so few Mizrahim on the court. That's not a bad thing. Long story short, a lot of people say, look at everything that's falling apart. Look at all the anxiety. Isn't this terrible? I come at it from the other side. All of these deep crises, deep problems, deep lacunae that we have had at the heart of our political life, at the heart of our shared existence. How is that going to look the day we finally notice them and tackle them? What was that going to look like? What was that day of reckoning going to be? Was it going to be any different from this? This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like to finally face up to the Constitution that might have worked in 1948, but we're too big, too complicated, too divided, too literally complex a society to still be, fly-by-night kind of lack of a constitution that we were 70 years ago. The realization, the moment of waking up to that is this. This is what that looks like. And everybody is responding in all kinds of really healthy ways, by which I mean it's profoundly painful. It feels like a fracture. It's the first real conversation Israelis have had with each other about these issues, definitely since Oslo, possibly since the 70s.
Haviv,
and that makes me very optimistic.
Let me jump in here. Are there other people who share your optimism? Or are you a lonely voice of optimism? And if so, who
It's a good question.
else? Yeah.
Everyone I say this to agrees with me in Israel. Or they
Because
say
having
something
just
like,
just returned from Israel about
yeah,
2 days ago, I found that there was definitely a siloism of people not, just echo chambers and people not hearing each other so much.
okay. I think that there certainly are echo chambers. First of all, the loudest people are either in the 35% on the left or in the 25% on the right. The 40% in the middle are in every poll. They're most people in regular life. They're my neighbors, and they're only growing. In other words, there is a sense that we are going to come out of this with the compromise, even among protesters, who their problem with this government is that they don't trust it, as far as they can throw it. Their problem is not judicial reform fundamentally for the vast majority of them. The case for judicial reform has been made. Were it not for the extremist folly of the way this was pushed forward by the people who pushed it forward, and that wasn't Netanyahu, there might today have been a very moderate, very thoughtful, very needed judicial reform. And so I think Israelis are aware of that. I have had this conversation many, many times, and that is something that people say, you're right, we're finally talking about it. Why does it hurt so much? Why am I so angry at everybody else? That I don't think that's a country falling apart. I think that's a country growing up.
So part of what I hear you're saying is that the things are so bad and can't get any worse, but perhaps it's that aspect of bringing out and opening up the stab, the wound, to be able then to get to the heart of the issue. So what do you see as the underlying issues, and coupled with that, one of the things is that something you just alluded to, in so many respects, the extremists are really served well by the lack of a compromise. Yes.
Yes, politically, you have forces. I mean, Ben Gvir has said this. Smotrich has said this publicly. I don't have to, try and guess what they think. They don't want a compromise. They're willing to, get a compromise because they think Netanyahu is going to break any minute, and they've been thinking that since day one. And so anything they can get, they'll get. But they would like it all to pass as is. They would like the court to be basically erased. I mean, that is what we saw in the original reform, the 61 override. Everyone here, I think, is familiar with some of them, or if not, look up some of these proposals. If you take the Levine proposals from January 4th seriously, the Israeli Supreme Court ceases to exist in any functional way, certainly the High Court of Justice side of it. And that's what they want, and they would like that to pass. Nobody else would. And so you do have that edge. You see on the left, the right has been arguing that the left's anger, these protests, are a Ashkenazi elite that doesn't like the fact that its cheese has been moved. For some now that was you could say that when there were 10,000 protesters. You had a harder time saying that when the number of people telling us in polls they had gone to a protest hit 1 million. There just aren't that many Ashkenazi elites. It has become something very large. But there is some section where it really is that kind of anger of elites feeling themselves displaced. And so you have these people who they're fighting a different fight in this debate, right? But for most Israelis, it is about solidarity. It is not about the technicalities of judicial reform. It's about trust. It's about whether that trust is breaking apart. And so I think that this is a fundamental conversation, 30 years overdue, and it's good that we're having it.
So that aspect of the lack of trust quite clearly seems to be what is driving so much of the polarization which exists there on both sides. One of the questions is that had been sent in earlier to me was, what is the status of the President Herzog's efforts at compromise, and why did those talks break down? Is there a possibility that he, through his good office, may be able to bring them back together during this time of the Knesset research?
I don't think that the solution will come. Yeah, I don't think the solution will come from there. But I think that his role has been extremely useful. It has, first of all, put people in the room who had that discussion. It put Likud and religious Zionism people in the room to have that conversation with Yesh Atid people, etc., on questions of reasonableness. On other questions, they understand that there is a middle ground. I'll give you an example. At the beginning, Levine's proposal was to have the Judicial Selection Committee be entirely coalition. The coalition alone, meaning the government, meaning the unitary executive legislative with no other checks, can appoint anyone it wants to the court. By the way, it can also at will with 61 votes change the basic law, giving us the number of the court, right? The number of judges, so it could pack the court and at will, almost in a week. It would have left the government absolutely supreme and the Supreme Court erasable and appoint. The coalition's response, the opposition's response at those talks was, we don't need the Bar Association and we don't need to give a veto to the justices. Yeah, we get it. We understand. But we do need you to have to reach across the aisle or you'll just stack the court forever and ever. And so the current proposal is half and half. Everybody needs the other side to appoint a justice. Now, that might be a terribly foolish idea because if you have one justice, essentially they'll make a deal where one justice is appointed by the right, one by the left. And since the right and the left will each want to show their base that they're doing their job, the right-wing justice will be an extremist and the left-wing justice will be an extremist. And instead of reaching across the aisle to agree on a single candidate who's in the middle, they're going to end up having two halves of a very extremist court. And the very fact that I'm telling you that that's the debate is wonderful. And that happened at Herzog's table. Then they left Herzog's table and started posturing and pontificating, and they had to pass reasonableness because of the politics. And Itamar Ben-Gvir doesn't want anything to pass and all of that. And so, or wants things to pass, doesn't want any compromise. And so all those dynamics are happening all at once. But at that table, they discovered that there is a substantive middle ground. And that's really important for the day when that becomes the political solution to the political problem they're facing.
So, and based on that, I'm going to ask some of the questions that have been sent to me. What are there any prospects for a unity government? It's something, that's been dangled out there, and in so many respects it makes so much sense, but there's so many obstacles to that happening, in terms of with Gantz coming in, perhaps, et cetera. What are you hearing about that, Haviv?
Not a chance.
Really?
Not a chance, barring a war with Iran.
I thought you're supposed to be the opposite.
Nobody can sign a deal with Netanyahu. That's not even everyone in Likud says, it's not even a thing, it's not even partisan to say, but just literally, Benny Gantz signed a unity agreement with Netanyahu 2 years ago. And the first thing that happened was that he then lost it. So Benny Gantz can never sign a deal with Netanyahu again. Netanyahu in the Knesset, there's a saying, and it's been a saying for about 5 years, with in political negotiations, you need a lot of credit. With Netanyahu, you take cash. And that's currently what's preventing that from happening. It's something that's been true basically for in that 5 election cycle.
In this conversation, you mentioned and you referred to some of the people in the current coalition. One of the questions that came in from one of our colleagues was how to talk about the inclusion of some of these extremists and individuals who have expressed very bigoted comments, such as Ben-Gvir and others. Any advice what we should be saying to our members of our communities about that? Well,
every single person on this call is a better expert than me on that. My dad's a rabbi and my father-in-law is a rabbi. So let me try to channel some of that experience. Okay. My suggestion, what I do when people invite me to explain what's happening out of that place of anxiety for Israel's future, for Israel's moral character, what I do is I just lay it out as plainly as possible. We are a country. We are not a moral narrative. We're not a cartoon running in some other people's heads. We're a country. If you put us on a pedestal, we're guaranteed to disappoint you. Also, we're kind of an amazing country. Also, we're a country with massive failures. We're a country, and people like Ben-Gvir represent roughly, at least before election day, 2% of the furthest 2% edge of Israeli politics. If you met the American 2% furthest edge of American politics, or the Canadian, or the French, or the British, I don't want to start, weighing in the balance each one's 2% edge, but he's the 2% edge. Netanyahu got him in, and without Netanyahu, he wouldn't be in, and he did it to win the election. And that's also something that happens, that kind of irresponsible leadership, that kind of leader. And now he's beholden to him. So, Netanyahu.
It works both ways, doesn't it? I was under the impression, or had heard when I was in Israel, that in certain respects, Netanyahu has said to Ben-Gvir when he threatens to leave or something like that, Gesundheit, hey, the door's open, knowing that he's never coming back into a government again. So going back to that issue about who's in
Yes and no. Ben-Gvir wants to leave. Ben-Gvir has to leave because Ben-Gvir has no base. And so, by the way, how is this government going to fall? That's basically the story of how this will eventually end. They have until March of 2025 before they have to pass a state budget again. And so they can't be toppled until Netanyahu can't be toppled. He can even lose his parliamentary majority, but he won't be able to pass legislation, but he can't be toppled unless they actually elect a new prime minister from within the Knesset, or a Knesset majority votes to go to elections. And so around March 2025, this is going to fall apart, probably in the months leading up to it. And the way it's going to fall apart is that Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has no base of his own, Netanyahu has a base. Netanyahu has people who will vote for him no matter what happens. Ditto Shas, United Torah Judaism, religious Zionism. They have a base they can rely on. Ben-Gvir has nothing. What Ben-Gvir is a rebellion. It's essentially a protest vote from the right against the center right, against the Netanyahus, because these are people who feel that Netanyahu keeps tilting to the left too much, keeps tilting to the center. And so Ben-Gvir will have to engineer a crisis to leave the coalition just so he has something to run on before the election. And that's probably what will topple the coalition. So Netanyahu threatens him Ben-Gvir has caused too many crises and challenged Netanyahu's authority openly too many times. And Netanyahu had to call him to order. And so he played his bluff. Essentially, they're both bluffing. But in the end, at the bottom line, if Netanyahu loses Ben-Gvir, that's worse for him than if Ben-Gvir walks away. In other words, Ben-Gvir will walk away and just run a protest campaign that'll get him into the next Knesset against Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the one who will lose the parliamentary majority. So even though Netanyahu does say that, I think that on balance, Netanyahu is the weaker side.
So let's stick with the judicial reform issue just for a moment. And that is, we have three components to it. This first one is the reasonableness clause. The first part of my question is there anything about that we, we basically just hear the headlines. What maybe unpack a little bit about what that is, how reasonable is what was passed or unreasonable is what was passed, and then what's the prospect for the Supreme Court hearing it and then, maybe accepting or reversing it. So focusing just on part of it right now.
Yeah, reasonableness is a great also kind of microcosm of the whole debate, of the whole way people are thinking about it. First of all, just really the baseline. The Israeli Supreme Court is two courts. It is a highest court of appeals from the lower courts, just like in America. But there's also another court, and it's the same justices and the same building. And that second court is called the High Court of Justice. And that's a court of direct appeal, a court of equity, as it's called in English law. And it's a court where anyone, anywhere, affected in any way by the Israeli state can appeal directly to the Israeli Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice. In about a week, the fee is, I think, 400 shekels, $30, something like that. They can come before an Israeli Supreme Court justice and they can lay out their case that the state is doing something bad to them. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the highest court of appeals. That's pretty much a standard thing, that standard kind of court. We're talking about its second function as the High Court of Justice, something that doesn't exist in America. It doesn't exist, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world at that level, at the highest court level. You have courts of equity. My father-in-law is in the Attorney General's office of the state of Maryland, Orthodox rabbi and lawyer. He's always right. But he tells me that there are courts of equity in Maryland as well, but they're lower courts. But in Israel, anybody can turn to this High Court of Justice at any time for any reason, and they take something like 4,000 or 5,000 appeals a year. It's this astonishing caseload. And in those cases, in those appeals, they have expanded standing till there's no limits on standing. You don't have to actually be a victim of the thing you're suing about. You just have to have an opinion. That is something that is unheard of in American law. You can't go to an American court if you're not the actual victim. If the ACLU wants to go to the American courts about abortion, they have to have a woman victimized by whatever state they're suing, right? Standing, justiciability, all of these legal principles, the court has expanded and expanded and expanded till there's just no limits. Reasonableness.
And not the whole court that sits on these issues either. It's smaller.
A single judge will hear 15 cases a day, try and get them off because he has to go to his other hat and deal with some major criminal appeals case from the lower courts, right? So it's also an incredibly overworked court. It's just a bad way to run courts, and on top of all the other ideological debates we're having. But that High Court of Justice over the years has expanded the reasonableness test. You have reasonableness tests in all legal systems in various ways. Reasonable search and seizure in American constitutional law means that the police to search your home need a warrant. Where do they get that warrant? They get that warrant from the court, right? A judge is the one who decides whether the search and seizure that the police want to conduct in your home is reasonable. These are completely ordinary, ancient, by the way, centuries-old principles in Anglo-Saxon law. Israel has a reasonableness test for executive action, and people go to the High Court of Justice and ask the court to rule on the reasonableness of an executive branch action. However, in Israel, I'm just going to send you to an article I wrote a few months back when Aryeh Deri had his latest case. It's long, I apologize, it's like 4,000 words, but it goes back 30 years ago to the first time Aaron Barak used reasonableness in this insanely expanded and unreasonable way, and essentially just said, I don't care what the law says, I don't like it, therefore it's not going to happen. And he didn't even bother not saying it that way. In other words, he said it that way. And so you'll see the Israeli court system has expanded reasonableness to that extent. Now, the original proposal to limit reasonableness by Levine wouldn't just have limited that massive expansion of reasonableness or limited it to certain decisions like cabinet appointments is where reasonableness really went haywire in the Israeli judicial system. And so don't let them, decide the reasonableness of a cabinet appointment. That's reasonable because cabinet appointments are part of the internal democratic system of the parliament. Maybe the court shouldn't have a say on that, just in terms of checks and balances. But the original proposal actually limited all reasonableness. In other words, I want to protest. The cop won't give me the permit because he doesn't like my political opinions. I will no longer be able to go to the court and ask for the court to rule on the reasonableness of the cop's decision. And now what passed was something much, much more limited. It was trying to limit the reasonableness of cabinet appointments, of executive decisions. It was not about local governments were exempted. All legislation was exempted. This was about something very, very targeted. Many legal scholars think it was poorly written. Many legal scholars think it's still too broad or broadly phrased. I tend to think they're right. This coalition has proven that it is just not doing this very competently, never mind all the other issues. But it was that very limited thing. The Israel after that passed is the same Israel as it was before that passed. All of the anxieties about it are absolutely legitimate and reasonable. And the right wing's anger at the court's misuse of reasonableness is legitimate and reasonable. And if you read that article, it's literally just the story of the 30 years ago decision that kind of lays out why the right's campaign against the court really took off and how the court misused it. So that's reasonableness. It's limited. It's not the original proposal that was actually very problematic and dangerous and literally an abridgment of personal rights. But the fear isn't crazy.
Any anticipation what may happen? I think this is going to be considered and reviewed by the court in mid-September.
It's going to be reviewed by the court, yes. And that's worth saying something maybe even a little bit unpleasant about. The Israeli Supreme Court and the Israeli Knesset profoundly disrespect themselves, and they profoundly disrespect the Israeli. In as much as there is a constitution, these basic laws that we still don't know if they're a constitution, because sometimes the court treats them as one and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the Knesset treats them as a constitution and sometimes it doesn't. The Knesset wants to say, 30 years ago, the Knesset passed basic law, human dignity and liberty. That was a law that was passed in 1992, and Aaron Barak, the Chief Justice, said, well, now I have this law. Every Israeli has a right to human dignity. And you know what that means? That means that I can decide if their human dignity is abridged in any case and in any place. And he writes that and he says that openly. And he says, this is a constitutional law. And therefore I can judge all other laws on whether they hurt human dignity. And therefore, there's a right to equality in Israeli law now, because that was never written down, because the ultra-Orthodox want to defend the rabbinical institutions, and the rabbinical institutions, halacha is often, not equal between men and women, etc. So there's no right to equality in Israeli law, but now there is a right, because how can you have dignity without equality? So now there's a right to equality. So Aaron Barak starts to expand out of this very, very brief right to human dignity, single sentence in a single bill back in 1992, a whole doctrine of an Israeli Bill of Rights, where basically it's all based on human dignity. That was the argument. Barak argued that that was a constitutional law. And because that's a constitutional law, he can cancel other laws that he believes conflict with it. 5 years ago, the Knesset passed another basic law. The basic law Jewish nation state. And it was controversial, and it was interesting and complicated and all of that. And the court took it up. There was an appeal to the court against its constitutionality. And the court said, it's kosher. It can stand. I like it. I don't like it, but it can stand. What's shocking is that the court even agreed to sit and judicially review a basic law, which the court had been arguing for 25 years is constitutional. How does a court rule on the constitutionality of a constitution? The court treats the basic laws as constitutional right up until it doesn't. And there doesn't seem to, other than political opinion, there doesn't seem to be a consistent standard. And the Knesset is exactly the same. The basic law, human liberty and dignity, passed in the Knesset with, I think, 3/4 of the Knesset not in the plenum. They were at the cafeteria. It was passed by a Knesset in between, after it had dissolved itself, before an election. It was passed where most MKs didn't even know what they were voting on. And then it was a basic law that gave us human dignity and liberty. The Knesset never made it what they call rigid. It was later voted on again in 94, and it's now 61 or something like that, but there's very low rigidity. Rigidity means how hard is it to change? Your constitution in America, right, is an absolute constitution, but also it's incredibly difficult to change it. That's what makes it a constitution. You need 3/4 of state legislatures. In Israel, to change the vast majority of our basic laws, you need a simple majority.
How many basic laws are there roughly?
I think they're 21.
And are these?
And they're very simple structural laws mostly.
Are they
Knesset,
conceptual principles?
No, they're almost entirely structural. There is a Knesset, there are elections, there is a judiciary, there's an executive branch. This is how the government works. This is how you pick a prime minister. You have to pass a budget at this time. There's very, very sort of detailed, structured basic laws, but they're not rigid almost at all. They can be changed by simple majorities. Folks, in Levine's original proposal back in January, it says explicitly, as a response to the Jewish nation state judicial review session 5 years ago, it says explicitly, basic laws will become immune to judicial review. That makes total sense. Of course they should be immune to judicial review. Then we have a constitution. The right is absolutely correct, except for one problem. They can be changed at a whim by the narrowest Knesset majority, and the Knesset changes them all the time. In the last 5 years, the basic laws have been amended 23 times. The Knesset treats the basic laws as ordinary laws, and any law the Knesset just doesn't want the court to be able to review, it literally only has to slap the word basic at the top, and the law becomes immune to judicial review under the government's plan. In other words, it's a plan that looks like it's giving us a constitution, but in fact was about erasing the court, not about giving us a constitution.
So in regard to this issue of the constitution, many of us certainly realize that.
I want to finish just one last sentence about it. Therefore, the court hasn't really given us that constitution. Maybe it shouldn't as a court, but it doesn't treat it as one. And the Knesset doesn't treat it as one. And that's the point. We have here a debate between two power centers, two branches, the only two branches we have, that is just not up to the task of this moment. They're not giving us more institutions, thoughtful, serious debate, consideration, negotiation. The Israeli people are being disserved by elites that are just not up to the task. Yes, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, because I want to follow up actually on the point you're making right now. We know that there was a thought about doing a constitution when Israel was first started in 1948. It was kicked down the road. It didn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. So is there a sense that maybe, obviously people feel there's a need for a constitution, but under current circumstances, is there a sense of, hey, we should do this? And if so, I don't see how that can happen because there is such polarization and people are going to be using it, or, it's like, so what's the prospects for this constitution thing? Is it necessary, et cetera?
Yeah, there's worse than polarization. There's just deep distrust, and you can't pass a constitution or anything constitutional without trust. And this government's disaster, the disaster this government represents, is that the first thing it did is lose all the trust. And then it tried to push it through violently in legislative terms, not actually violently, which is just the exact wrong way to do it, putting mildly. But there is a new debate about this, and it is deep, and it is everywhere. My neighbors, I have a neighbor who's a social worker in middle management in the welfare ministry and a social worker. He has been thinking about nothing else except the Israeli Supreme Court and how we need a new check on the Knesset so we can finally weaken the Israeli Supreme Court for 8 months. And he's not a lawyer, and he doesn't want to be a lawyer. It's in the bloodstream now, and this debate is happening. It was beginning to happen at Herzog's negotiations. Herzog made this point back in February when he gave that big speech on national television, and he said, if the right loses, then half the country will feel elections don't matter, and if the left loses, or the center left, or whatever you call them, loses, then they will believe that their democracy is being dismantled, and a lot of people in the coalition are doing their best to convince them of it. But there is a middle ground in which we build out more institutions. We give the right, it's what it's right about, and we build out more to settle, to calm the opposition, and not the opposition politicians, the voters, the people, the actual people. And then we build out a new constitution, and then Israel emerges. This is Herzog's words. Israel emerges from this not less democratic, but actually more democratic. So there is that. There's also a debate, a discussion now about solutions. What do you actually introduce into the system? And it turns out there's 1,000 things you could do. You could go very big and just add another House of Parliament elected by a different way of cross-sectioning the population, as you have in America, as you have in Austria. You could do that. That's very big, and they'll have a veto and all of that. You could go that way. That's big, that's expensive, that's complicated. That's a decade of negotiations. But you could do very, very simple things. For example, Denmark has our electoral system, proportional representation, single constituency. The people elect a party list nationwide in a nationwide constituency, as opposed to most parliamentary systems where there's local election. But Denmark has one feature that we lack. And that feature is that, you put in your ballot for your party, and on the back of the ballot, there's a primary. On the back of the ballot is the list of all the people running on that list, and you rank them 1 through 10, or you rank 1 through 20. And so the primary happens in real time on election day for each particular party. And that means that every single member of that party, once they're in parliament, stands on their own 2 feet and can oppose their own party leader, which is something that's a huge check on executive power in Britain, in Canada, in Australia.
Things
in
like
Denmark,
that being seriously considered in Israel now?
I don't know what, I mean, they're not being seriously considered in the sense that anybody's drafting the legislation, but in the brand new conversation Israelis are having, they're starting to notice that that would involve a printer, basically being a little word file being re-edited. It would be very easy. So there are a lot of easy solutions to introduce new ideas, and that is part of the conversation that's happening now. Yeah.
A couple of quick questions here. With the opposition to the current reforms, one of the things that's been said so often is by those who are leading the demonstrations on Saturday nights primarily, that the proposals are anti-democratic, and that it's moving towards a dictatorship. What's your sense of that? What's your comment on that?
On one leg, as the Talmud says. I think that we are bad at having a conversation about democracy. The very fact that 10 months ago, nobody was thinking about this outside of certain think tanks and certain elites, and 8 months ago, the whole country was on fire over this, tells me that it's a conversation about something else. It's a proxy. The debate over the Supreme Court is not about the Supreme Court. And what I think it's about is essentially the tribal nature of Israeli society, how fractured Israel is into religious and ethnic, groups that live apart, that have their own education systems, that the Israeli secular left is a tribe unto itself with its own school system. The Ashkenazim and Sfaradim among the ultra-Orthodox are separate, live apart, have their own schools. It works the same way in the Arab community. Israel is a country that is deeply, profoundly Middle Eastern. That can be hard to see from, for example, half the Jews of the world are American, and they're very Western. And Israelis are, of course, more than half the Jews come from the Arab world. All the Arabs come from the Arab world. 70% of Israeli society comes from the Arab world. And Israel is a society that thinks in Arab terms. Why do we have a proportional representation system in which Israelis don't vote by district for individual candidates, but vote for party lists? The party lists are understood by Israelis as representing those tribes. Tribes is a bad word for it. We call it sectors, we call it tribes. The English doesn't quite fit, but it's these cultural subgroups. What an Israeli election is about is taking those cultural subgroups and sending their representatives to the Knesset in proportion to their size in the population. And in the Knesset, they mediate our shared lives together. And in that sense, what is happening now is, for the first time in the history of Israel, there's never really been a majority tribe. They've always needed other tribes, and the tribes have always defended each other. That's really our one big check. Everything I said before, I left out the one big thing that actually has kept us a democracy, which weirdly is our tribalism. That seems to be falling apart. In other words, the coalition and the opposition, we went looking for what actual sociological feature correlates best to whether you voted for a party in the government or out of the government, because they're both very diverse. And the best correlation, and it's a very good correlation, 70% correlation, is religious practice. This is a government of religious Jews, 8,000 different kinds of religious Jews. And there's the half of Likud that's still secular, but that secular half of Likud is Mizrahi traditional mostly. And so this is a coalition of religious Jews, and everybody else is in the opposition. And so for the first time in Israel's history, we have a government where the tribes that always held each other in check, I mean, really held each other in check. For the last 10 years, Likud has repeatedly proposed, for example, a bill to lower the volume of the muezzin, of the Muslim call to prayer. And that bill has been repeatedly torpedoed, repeatedly taken off the docket in the Knesset by the ultra-Orthodox parties. And when Moshe Gafni was interviewed on Channel 12, and the anchor says to him, what do you care about the muezzin bill? Why do you care about whether mosques are allowed or not? He says openly, publicly, explicitly, and half jokingly, but not really jokingly, he says, look, right now the right-wingers are coming for the Arabs, but when the left-wingers are in power, who do you think they're going to come for? Right? And that's how it's always worked. I mean, always worked. In the last government, the 18 months of the Bennett-Lapid government, they repeatedly proposed bills that the ultra-Orthodox saw as an attack on them, and half of those bills were stopped by Ra'am. Now, that is not unusual, and that is not remarkable. That's just how it's always worked.
Well, it's
and
also
that's
politics makes strange bedfellows, very, very much so.
But that's falling apart because now we have this coalition that's so coherent and so unified. And so in a way, yeah.
I want to ask two last questions, then I do want to open it up and give you a chance to, our coverage to go longer than we anticipated. I appreciate it. It's been fascinating, but in case rabbis want to talk amongst ourselves, you're welcome to sit in on that if you want. But the two last questions. First of all, in terms of any thoughts you have, one of the things we deal with a lot is the involvement of American Jews, of rabbis in the whole conversation. Should we be weighing in with our whether it's our congressional elected representatives or not, et cetera? Any advice or counsel? What do you think about that aspect of the conversation?
I can only give you my deeply personal, entirely personal opinion.
Please.
I have no great theory or philosophy of this. At a gut level, you're Jews. You get to have an opinion on this. And if you want to influence and you want to fight and you want to scream and you want to shout, go for it. And if you want to do it using any means at your proposal, I think that's legitimate. There's a huge amount of right-wing American Jewish money in Israeli politics, and there's a huge amount of left-wing American Jewish money in Israeli politics. Israel hears American ideas and debates. You're a very loud country. Everybody hears you. And so the influence is there already. And if the Jews make their voices heard, that matters doubly so. That matters for reasons intrinsic to my belief that there's such a thing as a Jewish people. And you know, a lot of the Jewish people's future is going to be decided in Israel, and these are fundamental questions. These are not shallow little. I don't think you guys should be involved in sales tax decisions in Israel. That's just not fair because you're not paying the sales tax. But this is the future of the Jewish people, and I think it's absolutely fundamental for you to be involved. And
the last question I want to ask, and again, as I said, we'll spend about 10 minutes or so among colleagues if they'd like to be able to speak about that. And that is, can you go back to the point with which we opened? If you could summarize and maybe just give a short, your cause for optimism. I want to be sure we understand and maybe leave on a hopeful note our conversation.
Yeah, folks, it's going to get worse before it gets better. This is a very painful moment. We are having fights and we're screaming at each other about whether we are a democracy, will be a democracy, whether the screams that one side is destroying democracy is really just an elite oligarchy refusing to let the Mizrahi underclass finally have its day in the sun. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of visceral sense, a lot of decades of marginalization, literally generations of politics and identity are all suddenly coming to the fore. all of it has been festering. All of it is deep. All of it is something we've had to deal with, and we're going to have to deal with. And I'm glad it's happening, because every ounce of pain that we are feeling is real. This is real. This is all deep and real. The Israeli political right knows, and I have been at Kohelet, at the think tank that drove a lot of this, and I have been in those discussions, and I have been listening in the Knesset to these debates inside Likud. They know that they did this mistake. They screwed it up for themselves, and they understand that they screwed it up for themselves because they walked into it essentially from an echo chamber, essentially thinking they're the smartest people in the room and no lefty ever has anything to tell them. And on the opposition, they are dealing with the fact that most Israelis are in the middle. They can't just be against. They can't just topple the country, topple the. They really do have to show there is now a fight between both sides to show that they're the ones reaching across the aisle and that the other one is the one avoiding it. The basic chords of solidarity, the basic attachment that Israeli Jews have for each other, born in the refugee experience, that is the foundation of Israeli strength, is the foundation of Israeli democracy, is fighting back. And it's not just fighting back, it's proving that it can withstand this. This is the moment where we find out whether what we have is real. And it's proving to be absolutely real. Real, ordinary Israelis believe in that solidarity, show that in every poll. Governments and all these politicians who've made their living, they've made their living manipulating the public. They've made their living playing to the extremes. All of the phenomena that we're aware of that's happening all over the democratic world, the echo chambers of social media, all of the forces, the centrifugal forces pulling our societies apart in all these deep ways. In Israel, there is a fight back, and that fight back is winning at every turn. And so I am discovering how strong my country is. And every single thing that we have to fix now, every single thing that's hurting us is real. None of this is fake. We actually have to deal with these things. And I'm glad it's happening.
And I want to thank you for joining us, Haviv. Fascinating conversation. I got a number of comments from people really just appreciating that. Again, you're welcome to stick around, but let me just open it up to any comments, reactions, rabbis, colleagues want to have amongst ourselves. I'll just start and get the ball rolling. And by the way, Haviv, you may or may not agree with what some things I want to say, but in private conversations I had with several members of the coalition, when we talked about the 61 vote override, a couple of them said to me specifically, we never really expected that to be taken seriously. It was really just kind of a negotiating point. And in our conversation with the Prime Minister, he said the following, and this was several weeks ago, that that override clause was off the table and it's not going to be brought back up. And in point of fact, he asserted that in the Bloomberg interview yesterday. And then secondly, he said in regard to the appointment of judges, justices, that it's not going to be what we originally proposed. He specifically said that, nor can it continue the way it is. And so it sounds to me as if there is some, a desire at least for some compromise in some areas there. And so with that, just by way of introduction, is there anybody, and again, the invitation to everyone to come join us in Washington this coming week, where we're going to continue these conversations. Our conference is called Israel Advocacy, more challenging and more important than ever, very appropriate. So if anybody would like to, unmute and raise their hand or something so we can have an organized discussion, at least for a few moments, I'd like to do that. And I see, Neil, were you the first to raise your hand? Was that a hand raise? No. Okay.
No, I'd like to say thank you. I mean, I listen to Haviv on podcasts and so forth. So it's just a very difficult time for us, but critical in my opinion, for ZRC to help us hone that message coming up.
Thank you. Good. I appreciate it. Yeah, no, I think it's been a great conversation and very helpful in that regard. Anybody else? Please go ahead, David. I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I tried to chat it over. This whole concept of judicial review is really amazing and without a constitution in Israel, Haviv. And even in the United States, the power of judicial review is not delineated in the Constitution. It is a power that the court gave to itself through Marbury versus Madison, which is becoming a more and more interesting area of American law and legal theory, as in what is the check on the court, because it seems to be the only one of the three branches in DC that does not have a check, short of senatorial impeachment of a justice. So it seems to me that the issue is really with the basic law, as you were saying. the very weak nature of basic laws, that they can just slap a basic law, the name basic law, without requiring 80 or 90 votes in the Knesset, a hurdle of some kind, or a public a public vote on a particular issue that to affirm, as we would have to have here, a constitutional amendment, is the real issue. How are we going to get anything? And we're hitting this recursive situation now where the court is about to review a law passed as to whether it's allowed to review something. It seems rather, I find it hard. I find the optimism for Israeli society because of the activation of so many, but I find it hard to have any optimism for the Israeli legal system.
Haviv, any response to that question from David?
Yeah, we are first of all, I agree with every word you said. I also, Stuart, agree with every word you said. That my analysis has always been that this was folly rather than malice. They really thought it was just a negotiating position, and we're shocked that everyone took them seriously because the proposal dismantled democracy, but we didn't mean it. Why would you think we mean it? Now you need to trust us for everything else we want to do. It's just the scale of that folly is astonishing. Yeah, as for the court and as for the lack of a constitution, we are a country with a long and noble history of doing the right thing only at the very last possible moment after trying every single other option. And so if you follow the triple-digit inflation of the 1980s and how we finally dismantled the socialist sort of state-owned industrial base that destroyed our currency and destroyed our economy, that was something we did only after the economy was wiped out, at 1,000% inflation. But we did it, and then we flourished, right? So we keep 73 war, rebuilt the Israeli intelligence apparatus, but it took a 73 war to do it. We keep crashing, and it's like we're going over a cliff and we're falling and we're falling. We're not the country that stops before going over a cliff. We're the country that 3 inches from the ground figures out that we might be falling and that it's not just wind and does the right thing. We're going to fall. This is going to fall. And when we get back up, guys, the best news I have to tell you is we're a real country. Tomorrow morning, 2.5 million kids have to go to summer camp, right? This is a country with our own language, our own culture. The country is still going to be here. As Hillel Chalkin said in his Jewish Review of Books essay, which was kind of a shock to the system, certainly for many American Jewish conservatives, but that essay, which I urge you to read, it's this astonishing meditation that he's having on maybe Israel's really kind of falling. But then he says there a little line, and I don't think it's going anywhere near even remotely this, but his line is, Spain fell under a dictator, but 30 years later, it emerged from dictatorship and became a liberal European democracy. There's always tomorrow. There's always tomorrow. And the forces building that middle Israel, that new Israel, that good Israel that has that constitution, those forces are already a majority, and we haven't yet crashed. So that's why I'm optimistic.
We'll take one last question or comment. Jeff Salkin, please. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Haviv. I'm about to be uncharacteristically gloomy. And for those of you who know me well, uncharacteristically to the left. I think we are facing a cataclysm in the relationship between liberal American Jews and the state of Israel. And I think it's been coming for a long time. It's something that many of us, all of us, I particularly, certainly in my writing and my preaching, have been trying to forestall. I see a split. I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for us to interpret this, in particular to our young people, and especially on college campuses. I don't believe that I'm wrong. I want very much to be wrong. Haviv, can you give us a chizuk emunah on this? And it can't be business as usual, and I'm not accusing you of this. We're no longer in Hasbara you. We got to be real. We really got to get into the dirt here. Haviv?
I will be entirely characteristically, I think it's a bigger story. I think liberal American Jewish young people have been lost for a very long time. And they have not been lost because of Itamar Ben-Gvir, and they've not been lost because of Palestinians. We haven't really been a single people for about a century. We are now something like fifth cousins biologically. American Jews are the Jews who made it in before 1921 when the quotas came in, and Israeli Jews are all the rest of the Jews who didn't manage to get into America. And that's basically the big demographic truth of Israel and America. And these are the two big Jewish worlds. And I think we have a different religion. We have the same words, vocabulary, but we have so many fundamentally different assumptions about religion. We have different cultures. We have a different language. We have a different way of understanding history and our history. The last 100 years of history for American Jews and Israeli Jews have almost been opposite and produced opposite responses and opposite politics. American Jews, Israelis are Catholics to American Jews Protestantism. I don't mean in terms of the content of the religion. I mean American Jewish Orthodoxy as well is much more centered on the inner world of the inner spiritual journey of the individual, because that's where sort of American culture centers identity. And Israeli Jews are not. Israeli Jews, even secular left-wing Jews, are collectivist and think identity is something done between people, not inside them. There are so many, anthropologists have this idea of a big idea. A big idea is a fundamental assumption so big that we don't see it because we never talk about it because everybody knows it. And therefore we don't realize we all think it until we encounter a society that doesn't have it. And then we're shocked that they're so stupid. How can they not understand this fundamental thing? Our big ideas are different. And so my fear, if you've ever seen the Israeli movie Salach Shabati, about a Mizrahi, I think Iraqi immigrant to Israel, there's a scene there where he's planting a forest donated by an American donor. And the JNF in the 50s, it's a movie, it's fictional, but I'm sure it was also happened. Bring an American donor, show him the forest, it's the Goldberg forest, and then they take the American donor away, and then they bring another American donor. And the American donor is overweight and gregarious and very American in the eyes of 1950s Israel. And they take out the Goldberg forest sign and they put in the Rosenberg forest sign. And then they bring Mr. Rosenberg to look at his forest. And Salach Shabati, because he's such an idiot, this is Ephraim Kishon, it's his classic humor where the idiot is actually the wisest person in the room. Salach Shabati is planting these trees and sees them switch the donors and switch the forest. So as Mr. Rosenberg comes, Salach Shabati starts lifting the trees out of the ground because like, no, these are the Goldberg forest trees. You Mr. Rosenberg showed, you changed the sign, so I got to move the Goldberg forest. That's the image of American Jews to Israelis for generations. They don't know anything except that there's a bunch of names on the wall. And Israelis go through 12 years of public education in every one of our school systems, and they only learn about dead diasporas. They don't learn a single hour about a living diaspora. They know nothing about American Jews, and American Jews are 6 million people, 7 million people. And the same is true on the American Jewish side. I have heard from American Jews that Israel used to be liberal back when Golda Meir was prime minister, and now is no longer liberal. And I'm shocked that they think that, because there is no measure by which Israel is less liberal today than then. It is more liberal in every way than then, in the most fundamental ways you can imagine. And you find me a way it isn't, including toward the Palestinians. But then, back in the 70s, American Jews, the image inside the American Jewish mind of Israel was sanitized and clean and happy and joyful and pure. And today it's much more hard-bitten and real, and I think goes over the tip of reality into something else in many cases. And so we are only really cartoons in each other's minds. And to change that, in other words, I'm not just where you are. I am so vastly more pessimistic. Unless we as two societies get up and create a shared world, a shared understanding of each other, we're not going to agree. We don't need to agree, but we have to know each other. And we don't know each other. I have been criticizing Birthright's curriculum for a long time. They don't meet us, really us, deeply us. They don't meet Mizrahim and Ashkenazim and that fight and that history. They don't meet our experience. And unless Israelis really know American Jews, you're half the Jewish people. If we believe in the Jewish people, how is that possible that we know nothing about you? I have been yelling at Federation presidents for about a decade that if they used all of their influence and all their money to go to the Israeli prime minister and the Israeli education minister and slam their hand on the table and say, here's a curriculum written by, I don't know what, Jonathan Sarna at Brandeis, stick this in your school system now, or $2 billion of 501c3 funding that American Jews send to Israel every year is going to be something we start talking against. Because if you don't learn it, Israelis are not going to care about the Western Wall compromise unless they know what American Jews are and who they are. Israelis are not, you want to give us, you can't come here and tell us that judicial reform is right or wrong. Please be liberal. Ben Gvir is icky. That's not something we're going to listen to you. You want to teach us liberalism? Just teach us your experience, because you've gone through 100 years of liberalism coming true. And we spent 100 years with liberalism proving to be a false promise. And so teach us liberalism by teaching us your history. That's something that can happen. But there is no American Jewish lobby on the Israeli education system. The Jewish people is nothing if not an education system. So I agree with you completely. I think the project is immense. I don't think the Jews are even thinking about it.
Haviv, that was one of the realest things I've heard a journalist say in a long time. So thank you very much.
And let me take this opportunity to thank everyone both for your participation, your questions, and Haviv, it's been an extraordinary conversation. We're going to post it on our website so you can access it, and while others who weren't able to join us today can, and they can be shared as well. I think it's in many respects exactly why the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is here, is to be able to provide this kind of a forum and opportunity for us to, as colleagues, come together and talk about how we strengthen and build those bridges to each other, with each other. And so I wish everyone just a wonderful day, and let's hope that the optimistic vision that Haviv has conveyed to us may come to pass. Thank you, everyone.